In the first lecture, we established the foundations of Syed's argument. We learned that Orientalism is a discourse, a system that produces the Orient as an object of knowledge and rule. We learned that knowledge and power are inseparable. We learned about the textual attitude, preferring books to reality, and the distinction between latent, deep structure, and manifest, surface Orientalism. In this lecture, we move from the structure of Orientalism to its operation. How does Orientalism actually work in society? How does it maintain itself over time? How does it represent the Orient, and what are the consequences of that representation? And finally, what happens when the Orient begins to resist and speak back? One of the powerful concepts in Syed's book comes from Gramsci's idea of hegemony. Gramsci differentiated between two ways that a ruling group maintains power. The first is direct domination: the army, the police, the courts, and prisons. This is what Gramsci called political society. The second is hegemony, rule through consent, not force. This happens in what Gramsci called civil society: schools, universities, churches, newspapers, families, and cultural organizations. In civil society, ideas become so widespread and so normal that people accept them without thinking. They become common sense. Syed argues that Orientalism functions primarily through hegemony, not through direct force. Yes, European powers did use armies and police to conquer the Orient, but that is only half the story. The more lasting power of Orientalism comes from its presence in culture. It is taught in schools, it is repeated in novels, it appears in newspapers, it shapes travel guides, it influences movies and paintings. Over time, the Western public and even many Orientals come to believe that the Orient really is mysterious, backward, sensual, and despotic. These ideas are not imposed at gunpoint, they are absorbed through everyday life. Consider a simple example. When you hear the phrase the Middle East, what images come to mind? Deserts, camels, veiled women, oil sheikhs, terrorists. These images do not come from direct experience. Most of us have never been to the Middle East. They come from movies, news reports, novels, and school textbooks, and they are remarkably consistent. That consistency is the mark of hegemony. The idea of the Orient has become part of the air we breathe. Syed writes, it is hegemony, or rather the result of cultural hegemony at work, that gives Orientalism the durability and strength. Orientalism does not need to argue its case every time. It is already accepted as truth. The Westerner does not need to prove that the Orient is irrational. Everyone already knows it. That is how the hegemony works. This also explains why Orientalism is so hard to challenge. If you try to argue against it, you are not just arguing against a few scholars. You are arguing against a whole cultural system, against schools, libraries, museums, and the common sense of millions of people. That is a much harder task. Now we come to the very center of Orientalism: representation. What does representation mean? In everyday language, to represent something means to stand in for it, to show it, to describe it. But Syed gives representation a much stronger meaning. In Orientalism, the representation replaces the reality. The Westerner does not experience the Orient directly, he experiences a representation of the Orient, and that representation becomes more real than the Orient itself. Let me quote a famous line that Syed places at the beginning of his book. It is Karl Marx: they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Marx was writing about French peasants, but Syed applies it to the Orient. The Orient in Orientalist discourse is silent. It cannot speak for itself. It has no voice. Therefore, the Westerner must speak for it. The Orientalist becomes the mouthpiece of the Orient. But notice what this means. The Orientalist does not listen to the Orient and then repeat what he hears. The Orient has nothing to say. It is passive, inert, waiting to be animated by the Western voice. The Orientalist does not report, he creates. He gives the Orient a voice that is supposedly lacks. He speaks for it, and because he speaks for it, he controls it. Syed gives a famous example of Gustav Flaubert. In the 1840s, Flaubert traveled to Egypt. While there, he had a sexual encounter with a woman called Kuchuk Hanem, who was a dancer and courtesan. Flaubert wrote about this encounter in his letters and travel notes. He described Kuchuk Hanem in detail, her body, her dance, her smell, her snoring. But she never speaks in his account. She never expresses her own emotions or thoughts. She is just an object of Flaubert's observation and desire. This is a perfect model of Orientalism. She never spoke of herself. She never represented her emotions, presence, or history. He spoke for and represented her. Flaubert was a wealthy European man. Kuchuk Hanem was a poor Egyptian woman. That difference in power allowed Flaubert to claim that she was typically Oriental. His representation became the truth, not her lived experience. This is the violence of representation. It is not physical violence, it is the violence of being spoken for, of having your reality defined by someone else, in a language you do not control, for an audience that will never hear your side of the story. The Oriental is present in Orientalist texts as a silent figure, acted upon but never acting, described but never describing. Syed makes a very important theoretical point here. He says that we should not ask whether a representation is accurate or truthful. That is the wrong question. The right question is, what work does this representation do? Who produces it? For whom? With what authority and with what effects on the real people being represented? Once we ask these questions, we see that representation is never neutral, it is always an act of power. How does Orientalism represent the Orient? It does so by producing types, fixed, unchanging, essential characteristics that are supposed to define all Orientals everywhere and at all times. What are some of these types? Here are a few that appear again and again in Orientalist writing. The Oriental is irrational, driven by emotion and instinct, not by logic. The Oriental is despotic, naturally inclined to tyranny, and unable to understand democracy. The Oriental is sensual, obsessed with sex, easily aroused and morally loose. The Oriental is childlike, needing guidance and discipline from mature Westerners. The Oriental is lazy, lacking initiative and energy. The Oriental is dishonest, prone to lying, cheating, and intrigue. The Oriental is unchanging, stuck in a timeless past, unable to develop or modernize. These are not descriptions of real individuals, they are caricatures. But they have enormous power because they come wrapped in the language of science. They appear in scholarly books, in anthropological studies, in government reports. They are supported by footnotes and citations. They claim to be based on evidence on the study of languages, religions, laws, and customs. Syed traces this habit of typing back to the 18th century when European thinkers like Linnaeus and Buffon developed systems of classifying plants, animals, and then human races. The idea was that you could reduce a whole population to a few essential characters. These characters were supposed to be biological, linguistic, or cultural, but always inborn and permanent. Once a people was classified as Oriental, they could never escape that classification. The problem with that types is that they erase history. A real human being changes over time. A real society develops, struggles, learns, forgets, and reforms. But a type is frozen. The Orient in Orientalist discourse has no history. He is the same in the 7th century as he is in the 19th century. His past is just more of the same. His future is just more of the same. Nothing really happens to him, he merely exists. This is why Syed is so critical of the famous Orientalist scholar Gibb. Gibb wrote in 1945 that the Arab mind is characterized by atomism and discreteness, an inability to think in terms of law, system, or rational order. Gibb was writing about living, breathing Arabs in the 20th century. People who had fought colonialism, founded nations, written poetry, debated politics, but he reduced them all to a timeless mental defect. That is the power of typing. And notice the comparative structure of all typing. That Oriental is not just different, he is inferior. The Westerner is rational, the Oriental is irrational. The Westerner is honest, the Oriental is dishonest. The Westerner is dynamic, the Oriental is static. The type only makes sense in opposition to its Western counterpart. The Orient is what the West is not, it is the West's negative mirror. Now we come to the important turning point in Syed's argument. If Orientalism is so powerful, so hegemonic, so deeply embedded in Western culture, can it ever be challenged? Syed says yes, and he identifies the challenge as the crisis of Orientalism. What caused this crisis? The answer is simple: decolonization. After World War II, one after another, the colonies of Europe gained their independence. India in 1947, Indonesia in 1949, Sudan in 1956, Ghana in 1957, Algeria in 1962. The list goes on. In 1955, the Bandung Conference brought together leaders from Asia and Africa. People like Nehru, Sukarno, Nasser, Zhou Enlai, who declared their solidarity and their determination to shape their own futures. For Orientalism, this was a shock. For 100 years, Orientalist scholars had assumed that the Orient was passive, incapable of self government, unable to act on its own, waiting for the West to guide it. Now, suddenly, the Orient was acting. It was throwing off colonial rule, it was forming its own states, it was making demands, it was speaking back. How did Orientalism respond? Syed identifies three responses. First, denial. Some Orientalists simply pretended that nothing had changed. They continued to write as if colonialism still existed, as if the Orient was still a silent object of study. This response was increasingly untenable. Second, adaptation. Other Orientalists accepted that the political situation had changed, but they argued that the essential Orient had not. They rebranded themselves as area studies experts. They adopted this language of social science, modernization, elite behavior, political stability. But underneath the new jargon, the old assumptions remained. The Orient was still irrational, still despotic, still incapable of true development. Now, however, these claims were dressed up in statistics and graphs. Third is hostility. A third group of Orientalists went on offensive. They argued that the newly independent Orient was a threat. They wrote books and articles warning of the return of Islam, or the Arab mind, or the clash of civilizations. They portrayed nationalist leaders as fanatics, terrorists, or communist puppets. Their work provided intellectual cover for Western intervention. The crisis of Orientalism is therefore not yet resolved. Orientalism did not die when the empires fell. It adapted, it transformed, it found new homes in American universities, government agencies, and think tanks. The old Orientalist, with his knowledge of classical Arabic poetry, may be disappearing. But the new Orientalist, the social scientist who knows the Arab mind, is alive and well. Syed puts it this way: the Orient is not a free subject of thought or action. Even after independence, the West continues to define the Orient, to speak for it, to limit what can be said and done in its name. The crisis is ongoing. This brings us to the latest phase of Orientalism, which Syed discusses in the final section of his book. After World War II, the center of Western power shifted from Britain and France to the United States. With that shift came a new form of Orientalism. The old European Orientalism was philological. It was based on the study of ancient languages and texts. It valued erudition, history, and literature. It produced scholars like Sayce and Ernest Renan. The new American Orientalism is social scientific. It is based on economics, political science, sociology, and psychology. It values data models, predictions, and policy relevance. It produces experts who advise governments and corporations. What is lost in this shift? Syed argues that what is lost is human complexity. The social scientist sees the Orient as a set of variables: population growth, oil reserves, military spending, and political stability. The people of the Orient become numbers on a chart or cases in a study. Their literature, art, and inner lives, these are irrelevant. The social scientist does not read Arabic poetry, he reads spreadsheets. But note what does not change: the deep assumptions of latent Orientalism. The division between West and East, the belief in Western superiority, the denial of Oriental agency, all of these remain intact. They are simply expressed in a new language. Instead of saying the Oriental is irrational, the social scientist says traditional societies lack the cognitive framework for modernization. The meaning is the same. Syed gives an example from a 1967 report by Berger, a Princeton sociologist and president of the Middle East Studies Association. He wrote that the modern Middle East is not a center of great cultural achievement, nor is it likely to become one in the near future. The region had only in small degree the traits that attract scholarly attention. This is classic Orientalism. The Orient is judged by Western standards and found wanting. And this judgment comes from the president of the main professional organization for Middle East studies. It is not an individual opinion, it is institutional. The transformation of Orientalism into social science has made it harder to criticize. The old Orientalists could be accused of bias of racism, nostalgia for empire. The new expert is protected by the authority of science. His graphs and statistics seem objective. His policy recommendations seem pragmatic. But under the surface, the same old story is being told. The West knows the best. The Orient must be managed. We come now to the final theoretical theme: the silencing of the Oriental. Throughout the lecture, we have seen that the Oriental in Orientalist discourse is spoken for, not speaking. He is an object, not a subject. He is represented, not representing himself. Syed is very clear that this is not just an intellectual problem. It has real material consequences. When Western policymakers rely on Orientalist expertise, they make decisions that affect millions of lives. Decisions about war, peace, aid, sanctions, and occupation. And in those decisions, the voices of Orientals are rarely heard. When they are heard, they are dismissed as irrational, fanatical, or ungrateful. Syed writes from personal experience. He was a Palestinian Arab Christian born in Jerusalem, raised in Cairo, educated in Western schools. He knew the Orient from the inside, but he also knew the West from the inside. He understood both worlds and he saw how the West systematically silenced his own people. The Arab, he writes, is seen as the disruptor of Israel's and the West's existence. He is reduced to a stereotype: the terrorist, oil sheikh, and the camel riding nomad. What is to be done? Syed is very careful here. He does not propose replacing Orientalism with an Occidentalism, a reverse essentialism that stereotypes the West. That would just be more of the same mistake. He does not argue that only Orientals can study the Orient. That would be a form of identity politics that he rejects. And he does not claim that there is a true Orient behind the representations. That would just be a different kind of essentialism. Instead, Syed calls for critical consciousness. The scholar, whether Western or Oriental, must be aware of the power structures in which knowledge is produced. He must question the assumptions of his field. He must resist the temptation to speak for others. He must learn to listen. He must recognize that all representations are partial, interested, and situated. And he must remember that the ultimate purpose of scholarship is not to serve the state or the market, but to promote human freedom and knowledge. Syed ends his book with a warning. Systems of thought like Orientalism, he says, are mind-forged manacles, chains that we have made for ourselves and that we can, with effort, break. The answer is not a new system, but a permanent vigilance. The scholar must always ask who is speaking, for whom, to whom, with what authority, and with what consequences for the real. living, breathing human beings who are being represented. Let us conclude this lecture. First, the structures that Sayed analyzed have not disappeared. Western governments still rely on experts who claim to know the Orient. The media still reproduce stereotypes of Arabs, Muslims, and Asians. The language of latent Orientalism, irrational, despotic, fanatical, unchanging, is still used in political discourse. Second, the power that Syed described has shifted but not ended. The United States, not Britain or France, is now the dominant Western power in the Middle East. But the basic relationship, a strong West defining a weak East, remains the same. Third, the resistance that Syed noted has grown. Oriental intellectuals, artists, and activists have challenged Orientalist representations. They have told their own stories in their own voices for their own purposes. They have shown that the Orient can speak and that when it speaks, it has much to say. Orientalism is not a relic of the past, it is a living discourse, constantly adapting, constantly renewing itself. The task that Syed set for us to understand how knowledge and power are linked, to question the authority of experts, to listen to those who are silenced, that task is as urgent today as it was in 1978.